The district hums in the softened light of late afternoon. Somewhere in the distance, a screen door groans open, then clicks shut behind a child who races down the sidewalk. Sneakers slap pavement as the breeze lifts leaves just enough to carry. Whispers between branches. A dog barks once, then thinks better of it, and nothing presses, nothing rushes. The world is between heartbeats, and from behind a chain-linked fence. The sound comes, a clean, percussive thump, then another dot rhythm, almost musical. As rubber meets taut strings and leather-gripped promise arcs across an empty, sun-baked tennis court, the air carries that sound like it's sacred, as if it has always been there. And perhaps, in a way, it has. Just beyond the metal fence, a girl lingers in her stance legs, bent, head steady, eyes locked forward like time itself is balancing. On her racket strings, she does not see the noise as remarkable, only necessary. Her name is Billie Jean. She is 11, but already she has seen too much to let herself move quietly. This is the beginning of her forever. Her arm swings, another shot collides, hollow and perfect. Somehow, it seems that even the sun takes a breath. Billie Jean King is not a story one. Tells all at once. She is a shifting reflection found in the rally, in the pause before serve, in the silence shared between opponents during a respectful switch of sides. She is not just athlete, she is architect. She is legacy told, not in trophies, but in timbre, the softened liberation of truth spoken gently to deaf halls, again and again, until the walls learned how to listen. Now, you may only know the name, and that is fine, because tonight, we do not rush to know. We let her emerge like a figure crossing through morning fogs, footed but unshaken. A woman made of footwork and fire, kindness and courage, wit and will. She comes not as thunder, but as echo. We will tell her story as stories ought to be told, not performed, but remembered, as if our bones were already there for the first serve, and our minds merely need reminding. But first slow down. You are here now. You are safe. The room quiets. Let your shoulders fall from your ears. Your breath loosen into rhythm with your pulse. Forget business. Forget burden. Let distraction dissolve like morning haze. There is nowhere to get to. Nowhere better than here. Not tonight, because tonight you will travel within the cocoon of tale and time. You will walk alongside a girl in keds with grit in her eyelash and a used racket in her hand. You will watch her question the inarguable and challenge gravity itself. With each volley, you will lose yourself in rallies and protests alike. You will hear shoes squeak on clay, and papers flutter as history rewrites itself under slow-moving fingertips. You need only listen, because Billie Jean King is more than a name. Spoken from podiums or chanted from stadium bleachers, she is courage, made conversational. Tennis, made truth, movement not as spectacle but as whisper. And so we begin. Imagine a court with no audience, no scoreboard, no netcord judges, no broadcast team retelling percentages between points, just asphalt, cracked in the corners, chalk lines, faded with time and rainfall, a net loose, slightly sagging, still a sacred square. It's where she first found it, the game that would shape her life in a single afternoon. She will go on to face champions and change governments. But it all starts here. She returned to this memory often, not because she's sentimental, but because it is honest. The first time the strings met the ball, she felt it deep in the chest, like recognition, like remembering something you didn't know you had forgotten. She did not step onto the court to become an icon. She stepped there because something in her hungered for precision, for friction, for fairness, and tennis handed her those things. One brushed baseline at a time. She could already feel it, that the court was more than rectangle and rules. It was potential, writ, physical ball, bounce, swing, truth framed in ritual, and that would be enough to play honorably. But for Billie, enough was never enough. They won't teach you this in highlight reels. There are no slow-motion montages for grit alone. But grit is the artifact from which her legacy is carved. A child who saved up quarters to buy used tennis shoes. A girl rebuffed from country clubs because girls, like Herthos without pedigree or pearls, didn't belong. She would practice on public courts with chain, nets, and pebbled cement. She would practice when boys laughed and told her to sit with the girls and learn to cheer. She would practice even when there were no other girls to play with, and the wall became her only opponent. She would hit again and again until the brick started, returning volleys almost as well as the boys did. Better, maybe. It was lonely sometimes, but solitude taught her everything about silence, about how much louder a whisper can be when it's the only sound refusing to fade. The house on La Posada Street was modest, tucked into a row of almost matching homes that breathed the same ocean air, only 5 miles from the Pacific. A boy rode by on a stubby bike with baseball cards rattling in his spokes. Lawns grew just wild enough to prove they belonged to real families, working ones. Inside, the Moffat family lived not grandly, but solidly. They shared meals, shared laughter, shared chores. Billie Jean's father, Bill, was a fireman. Tall, quietly principled, a man of structure and modest pride. Her mother, Betty, worked long days as a housekeeper and later as a secretary, her hands always busy, her thoughts practical and steady. Billie Jean would remember watching her mother's efficiency in motion, the way her shoes moved across linoleum, how she always seemed to find a rhythm and keep the household stitched together, even when the seams pulled tight. The Moffats didn't entertain extravagance, but they did make room for movement. Billie Jean climbed trees, sprinted through sprinkler-strewn streets, and crashed into fences without apology. From early on, her body challenged stillness. It demanded physics to reckon with. It wanted to clash and bounce and conquer. She rode horses, tossed softballs, tried her tiny hands at basketball and volleyball and baseball. If it had a score, she wanted to beat it. If it didn't, she'd find a way to turn it into a game that did. At school, she was a good student, sharp and attentive, but sports were where she shined. There was a natural economy to the way she moved. No wasted steps, no hesitation, a competitive glint tucked just behind her smile. Coaches noticed, and even the boys, reluctant as they might be, learnt that Billie Jean wasn't just good for a girl. She was good, period. Still, tennis hadn't arrived yet. Not quite. That moment, like most important moments, slipped in, without ceremony. She was 11, tagging along to a public park with a friend. The court shimmered in summer heat, vacant and inviting. Someone handed her a racket. It felt awkward at first, the strings too tight, the grip too slippery. But then, contact. That first clean hit, the kind that sends vibration right up the arms and leaves sensation in the chest long after the ball is gone. It was unmistakable, a resonance not of impact, but alignment. She left the court changed, walking quietly but charged, like the first sparks had found wire. She turned to her mother with the simple certainty of a compass. I'm going to be #1 in the world. There's a difference, subtle but deep, between ambition and vision. Billie Jean didn't dream the idea. She recognized it, like naming something already awake inside her. But recognition would not smooth the path ahead. In those days, tennis was a country club, game-groomed lawns, white skirts, and quiet nods exchanged over hushed applause. Entry didn't depend only on talent, but on appearance, cost, and connections. Billie Jean had none of those. What she had instead was determination that did not blink. She scraped and saved to buy a racket. Saved again for 50-cent-a-week lessons. The teacher, Clyde Walker, witnessed what raw intensity looked like, wrapped in a child's frame concentration so sharp it added decades to her strokes. She learned fast, practiced even faster, but she never forgot the imbalance. Not when told. She couldn't play at certain clubs. Not when she realized many of her male counterparts were taken more seriously merely by standing still. There was always another gate, another unspoken rule. But Billie Jean did what she would do for the rest of her life. Ask why, not dramatically, not confrontationally, just with matter-of-fact persistence. Even before she had a platform, she had questions. Why couldn't girls serve like the boys? Why were women's matches shorter best-of-3 instead of 5? Why did girls have to wear dresses to practice? She once told her parents, in clear exasperation, that she didn't see the point of learning, cooking, and sewing when there were so many courts she could be mastering. And though her voice was quiet, there was substance in her stillness, a core that didn't need volume to feel unimal viable. By the time Billie Jean entered high school, her reputation had begun to spread along Southern California's junior tennis circuit. Not yet a name, but a problem for any competitor unprepared for the force of her volley or the precision of her backhand. She was quick, always, but her real weapon was how she thought. 3 shots ahead, angles over adrenaline. She studied her opponents, notebooks filled with observations of playing styles. She already saw tennis as language one that might one day be used to do more than win points. It helped that her younger brother, Randy, would also grow up competitive, a strong athlete who'd go on to pitch professionally in Major League Baseball. The house pulsed with effort, with energy sharpened by respect. Still, the world outside rarely mirrored that encouragement. At 12, Billie Jean attended a group tennis clinic for juniors. At the end of practice, a photographer lined up the kids for a shot, but Billie Jean wasn't invited into the image. She asked why. "You're not wearing the proper tennis whites," she was told. Innocent rules, some said. But Billie Jean knew even then that exclusion by dress code was never merely about clothes, and so began her education, not just in sport, but in resistance. Small moments stacked into conviction. She would return to that snapshot in her memory, often the space where she should have stood, where she was missing. In time, she would make sure no girl ever needed permission to exist, where she naturally belonged. That was one of her first promises to herself, and later, to the world. She didn't chase invitation. She built doors. The California State University campus, tucked beside Long Beach's salt-kissed streets, thrummed with activity. Young minds wandered between classes, notebooks slung under arms, dreams folded between assignments. Not far from the library, Billie Jean kicked at the edge of a planter as she waited for practice, that ever-restless energy searching for edge. There was always a next match, a next point, a next inch to gain, somehow. She had enrolled at Los Angeles State College in 1961, not just to learn, but to keep moving. For Billie Jean, education didn't stop at the classroom door. It extended to every corridor, every court, every encounter. She studied not just subjects and serves, but systems, match footage, training journals, social structures, how winning worked on the court and in a culture that didn't expect her to want more. Even early on, she moved differently. In class, she challenged assumptions. In games, she changed tempo with the precision of a strategist. She wasn't yet Billie Jean King, not fully, but the shape of her was settling. The blend of kindness, urgency, and clarity that would define her was already in motion. By then, she had met Larry King, not the broadcaster, but the law student, the friend-turned-partner who saw Billie Jean's ambition not as competition, but as conviction. Their courtship was quiet, yet tethered by mutual purpose. Larry would become a steady figure beside her in the coming waves of furring structure at times when the implosion of expectation might have pulled her under. Their marriage wasn't merely romantic, it was tactical. At a time when deviation from norms invited danger, their union afforded her a bandwidth of freedom even as her inner identity began whispering deeper truths than she could yet speak aloud. In 1961, just 17 years old, Billie Jean would step into history at Wimbledon. She didn't win the singles. Not yet. That moment would wait. But in doubles, teamed with Karen Hunt-Sussman, she seized the title. It was no fluke. The victory was sewn stitch by stitch, relentless rallies, methodical net play, poise even under pressure. The youngest team to win women's doubles at Wimbledon. To casual fans, it was a delightful surprise. To Billie Jean, it was a memo to the future. She had arrived. As the trophies multiplied, so did the questions. The 1960s saw tennis crouching on the edge of transformation. The sport was still technically amateur. Prize money was scattered and unbalanced. The circuit ran on tradition and expectations, engineered largely by men. But Billie Jean was not invested in convenience. She didn't just play to win, she played to understand why events were organized a certain way, why rankings functioned with so little transparency, why professional athletes received scraps compared to what they earned behind closed doors for the powers that ran the calendar. She kept notebooks, asked too many questions. Some thought she made mental maps of conversations, tracked tournament directors' comments, noticed every pattern, overt or hidden. There was a method to her remarks, gentle but firm, always respectful but never deferential to dogma. Fellow players took note. Some drew back, but others gravitated toward her, the quiet reckoners, the ones with grit behind grace, those who tired of smiling through inequality. As the 1960s gave way to the early 70s, the tide began to churn. The sport shifted toward open formats, welcoming professionals, promising bigger payouts. A new dawn, they said. But it wasn't dawn for everyone. Tournament payouts bore stark comparisons. Male champions walked away with paychecks 3, 5, sometimes 8 times larger than their female counterparts. The justification: audience numbers, interest, tradition. Billie Jean heard it all and felt each line like a bruise. She had been winning with power and finesse for over a decade. She wasn't asking for charity. She was asking for logic and fairness. Those who knew her best recall how her eyes would set when someone told her something couldn't be changed. Not angry, of a still heat, like a stove turned low. Waiting, she began organizing. Quietly, phone calls stretched across state lines. Hotel lobbies became war rooms, and dollar bills, the symbolic kind, were pressed into hands not as tips, but as contracts. She didn't wield a gavel or a bullhorn. She simply gathered the willing one woman, then another dot in 1970, together with 8 other female athletes. She signed a symbolic $1 contract with promoter Gladys Heldman, launching the Virginia Slims circuit, the original 9 they'd come to be known. Each of them risked suspension, career ruin, and public ridicule. But as Billie Jean would later put it, we wanted any girl in the world, if she was good enough, to have a place to compete. It was not rebellion for rebellion's sake. It was structure's renewal, a counterstructure born of necessity and sustained by excellence. Billie Jean still played singles, still won time after time, but now the stakes rose beyond mere personal trophy shelves. She became a compass. Opponents continued to underestimate her resolve until they saw it up close, how she prepared, how she dissected a game plan, how every toss, every breath served design. Her style, distinct, drew from aggressive net rushes, lightning approaches, volleys, chipped and charged with meaning. To watch her was not merely to watch victory, was to witness articulation. Every precise motion spoke, "I belong," and between the strokes, Billie Jean began molding something that outlasts match point, reform. She studied more than footwork. She studied legal mechanisms, business models, organizational hierarchies. She could talk contracts as fluently as cross-court slices. When journalists pressed for comment about inequity, she didn't defer, she educated. And when executives dismissed her proposals as cute or premature, she returned with evidence and, occasionally, with allies. The WTA wouldn't form overnight, but its seeds were planted between press conferences and practice courts, in whispered meetings over diner coffee, in signatures scribbled in suffocating hotel ballrooms beneath inadequate light. She faced criticism from men, from media, even from some women. But Billie Jean never needed approval. To proceed, she moved with that same economy of effort as in her youth, direct, honest, without ornament. The same girl who had once slammed balls into the side of a garage Avon when the world refused to return the serve, was now volleying against systems. The court remained her ground, but the stakes had risen. It wasn't just about changing scorelines anymore. It was about changing the structures that dictated who got to play beneath the lights at all. By the early 1970s, Billie Jean King had already claimed her place near the top of the tennis world. She had won titles at Wimbledon, the US Open, and the French. The accolades accrued, papered over with modest interviews and gracious nods. But beneath the trophies was something more: constained tension that refused to loosen. It wasn't just the matches, it was the space between them, the lingering discrepancy in how victories were valued depending on who held the racket. Billie Jean never played in a vacuum. Each point she earned came traced with implication. A win was never just a win, it was also a question. Would this one finally be enough? She ruled on grass with a style both classic and revolutionary. Her net play fearless and refined flattened opponents who underestimated just how calculated it all was. She advanced without apology, striking volleys that echoed louder than headlines, against Margaret Court, against Rosie Casals, against a young Chris Evert who brought her own brand of poetic severity to the baseline. Billie Jean handled them all, not with disdain, but with honor. She respected the game, and she devoured it. And yet, off the court, Respect asked different terms. Posters showed smiling winners. Contracts showed disparity. Women who triumphed still earned a fraction, sometimes a sliver, of what came so easily. Two men who hadn't made it halfway through the draw. When challenged, promoters and commentators smiled nervously. They referenced ticket sales, advertising metrics. Doubts simmered under the surface, safe behind a handshake or dismissive nod. But Billie Jean always noticed. She had noticed since she was 12, excluded from a group photo for wearing the wrong tennis whites. The pattern never stopped repeating, so she fought, quietly, insistently, sometimes lonely, but never unsure, and all the while, another silence hummed behind the rallies, within the elegant contours of competition. Billie Jean struggled with truths she was still learning how to hold. The growing realization that her romantic attachments, the real ones, did not lie where tradition expected them to. Her public life was curated. Billie and Larry, active advocates, working partners. Their bond was sincere, and yet her private self often moved separately. A different rhythm, softer and more fragile. She carried that duality with intentional grace, telling almost no one, even as the weight of authenticity pressed harder with each season. Still, she played, and she led. In 1973, seated in a hotel conference room, she gathered with other women, fellow professionals, trailblazers, still tasting the risk of the original. Nine's defiance. They discussed what had long lived only in the pause between sentences. They discussed foundation, structure, unity, a future shaped by the players themselves. From that conversation, the Women's Tennis Association was born. They held no press event, just consensus, just purpose. 9 years earlier, they hadn't even been allowed to use professional next to their names at some tournaments. Now, they were building an institution with permanence. The WTA wasn't about rebellion. It wasn't bitterness. It was business. Fair business. Each woman involved knew the price they might pay: loss of sponsorships, threats from male players, the callous familiarity of disrespect. Billie Jean knew most of all. She stood at the helm not by appointment, but by presence. A leader not through stature, but by the tone of impact. She invited no hierarchy, only action. Players came from different countries, backgrounds, and playing styles, but all of them understood what they were part of. Not just tennis, but transformation. Meanwhile, the titles continued. Wimbledon, where Billie Jean would win 6 singles crowns between 1966 and 1975, remained her cathedral. The center court stage, made of divine grass and relentless grace. But for Billie Jean, even those high holy grounds weren't sacred if they served exclusion more than equality. In 1970, the prize for winning Wimbledon, one of the most cherished tournaments in the world, was £750 for women, compared to £2,000 for men. The numbers never lied. They just whispered until someone listened. Off court, Billie Jean grew more comfortable with her voice in complex spaces. She had learned diplomacy, learned when to let the question sit and when to strike it clean. She became a consistent advocate for Title IX landmark U.S. legislation prohibiting sex-based discrimination in federally funded education programs. The law wasn't just about school sports. It was about societal expectation, an opportunity to Billie Jean. The tennis court had always been a metaphor for access. No matter how beautifully you played, it was irrelevant if you weren't allowed through the gate. So she swung with her words like she swung with her racket, peppering carefully, with an eye toward placement, until her point cleared the net, and there were casualties. Some friendships wore thin. Some endorsements vanished. Media coverage often veered condescending or cruel. None of that made her invulnerable. She felt it all, but she rarely flinched. She had found that certain truths, once acknowledged, refused to be folded back up, and her mission, though unbidden, was now undeniable. She didn't just want fair play. She wanted the entire game, reimagined because she knew this much. You could not build the future by waiting for permission. You had to serve first. The year was 1973. The headlines were bold, the hooks irresistible. Battle of the Sexes. A tennis match framed as a showdown of biology and belief, spectacle and symbolism. But beneath the buzzwords and broadcast flair, it was something quieter, deeper. It was a moment not entirely born from rivalry, but from clarity. He was Bobby Riggs, a Wimbledon champion, once ranked #1 in the world. But now, in his 50s, more showman than sportsman, retired hustler with a flair for provocation. He claimed women's tennis was a joke, that even now, past his prime, he could beat any top female player, and people listened, not because it was true, but because the myth felt comfortable. Bobby knew what he was doing. It was performance, laced with just enough condescension to roil the waters. He had already defeated Margaret Court earlier that year, and the victory emboldened him. The so-called Mother's Day massacre became his proof. But Billie Jean King was not. Margaret, and this match would not be noise. It would be message. She had declined his first challenge. She didn't want to legitimize a stunt. But after he beat Court, she recognized the weight. The story was already being told. If she didn't step forward, someone else would dond. The implications wouldn't wait. So she agreed. It wasn't a game. It was legacy in motion. Weeks before the match, Billie Jean began preparing with a rigor unmatched in her career. Not just in hours, but in details. Physical training, yes, but also psychological, strategy, endurance. She studied Riggs's style, his decoy tactics, his public provocations, his strengths, which were waning, his weaknesses, which were many. She knew he'd try to trick her with soft serves and slice shots, trying to slow the pace, frustrate rhythm. He would chatter, entertain, distract, but Billie Jean came to win. The venue was the Houston Astrodome, once dubbed the eighth wonder of the world. That night, more than 30,000 people filled the stands. Another 90 million watched from home. Cameras, commentators, a global audience. Primed for a verdict, she entered like Cleopatra, a gold-leafed litter carried by male athletes dressed as ancient servants. It was humor, laced with precision. She smiled, but her eyes didn't break. Bobby rolled in beside her with a piglet in tow. A nod to his own words, women belong in the bedroom and the kitchen. The crowd played along, laughed en masse. But Billie Jean didn't play. Underneath her focus, something still pressed. This wasn't just spectacle. This was a referendum. She didn't play risky, and she didn't play cute. She played with algorithms hidden inside her breath. Nerves ironed into poise. From the first serve, it was clear Billie Jean came with purpose. She didn't fall for his gimmicks, didn't rush or overextend. She kept him moving, side to side, shot to shot, dragging his legs, unraveling his shape. Every stroke a lesson. Not loud, but exact. She took the first set, 6-4.1, the second, 6-3. Closed the third, 6-3 again. Straight sets. Triumph, not just as athlete versus athlete, but as symbol versus system. When it ended, she barely celebrated. No jumping, no outstretched arms to the crowd. Just a quiet wave and the comfort of completion. In interviews later, Riggs admitted surprise. He hadn't expected her to play him so smart. Had thought she'd run too hot, too quickly. That she'd burn out before the midpoint. But she hadn't, because this match wasn't made for the moment. It was made for the message. And afterward, that message rippled far beyond the baselines. Corporate sponsors began to rethink investments in women's sports. Tournament organizers saw new audiences, new revenue streams, schools, clubs, networks. It wasn't a floodgate, but it was a fault line, more importantly. For young girls watching around the world, it was confirmation that strength did not expire at stereotypes, that brilliance did not ask for approval, that the court could be neutral ground, but only if fought for. Some critics would try to diminish the match's meaning later, calling it a gimmick, a media farce. But they missed the angle, because Billie Jean's victory wasn't just about tennis, it was about audacity. The audacity to meet mockery, not with outrage, but with majesty, to defund doubt through performance, to turn insult into memory, and memory into milestone. And long after the dome emptied and the ticker tape faded, the echo remained. Not the scoreboard, not the page one photo, but the sense, quiet and pulsing, that the game had changed because one woman had dared to swing for all of us. The crowd had long gone home, the applause hushed to memory, the lights over center court powered down one by one. Yet Billie Jean remained imagined or otherwise at the baseline, still tracking each bounce, each choice, because even after the game continued. In the years following the Battle of the Sexes, Billie Jean King didn't vanish into quiet laurels. She kept playing, kept winning, but something had shifted. The crowd's eyes were wider now. Recognition glowed where once there had been dismissal. And yet, real change is never a single volley. It is collections of choices, of risks, of relentless movement. The victories started costing more. Her body, for one. Years of charged momentum had exacted their tax. Her knees ached more frequently. Her joints whispered unease into her sleep. She played through it in 1975. She was ranked world number one again. That stillness of confidence, that sacred hum of competency remained untouched. But the seasons tugged harder now. Younger competitors arrived, Tracy Austin, Martina Neb, and waves behind them, echoing her once radical insistence that the court was theirs to shape, not merely enter. Billie Jean didn't resent them. She studied them, whispered encouragement between sets, saw in them the outline of a future she had, once only imagined clinging to chain-link fences. But off the court, another match was reaching its inflection point. It came in the form of a lawsuit. A name, a statement made public without warning. Marilyn Barnett. Billie Jean had met her in the late 1960s. Their relationship, quiet and intimate, had unfurled beneath fatigue and familiarity in hotel rooms and whispered confidences between hotel tours. Billie Jean, still married to Larry, conflicted but clear, had spent years guarding that truth like a flame she couldn't explain but couldn't extinguish either. Now, in 1981, the secret had been spoken for her, and the silence shattered. The press latched, instantly magnifying, mischaracterizing, hungry to flatten complexity into scandal. America did not yet know how to hold this kind of vulnerability. Few did. Within days, endorsements evaporated. Sponsors fled. Varied networks of affiliation, corporate, athletic, even personal, stepped back under the guise of protocol. Yet Billie Jean stood there. Unflinching, she confirmed the relationship. Publicly and plainly, she said the words, then answered questions. Not defensive, not righteous, just ... UNHIDDEN. It was not a triumphant coming out. It was layered in pain and betrayal, and she never tried to make it seem otherwise. But she didn't run, because somewhere in each version of herself, child, champion, advocate, partner, had always lived the refusal to disappear when it mattered most. She and Larry divorced later that year. The quiet parting of two people who had shared real things but had run out of road. What followed wasn't restoration, but expansion. Billie Jean stepped back from tennis gradually, less from shame than necessity. Her body could no longer keep up. With her ambition, her spirit still swung openly, but her knees no longer bent on schedule. From full matches to exhibitions, her relationship with the game recalibrated. Not smaller, just different. And in retirement, she did not rest. She founded the Women's Sports Foundation, offering resources, mentorship, and infrastructure to ensure that her legacy wouldn't belong only to memory, but to momentum. She became louder for women, for visibility, for the right to be multiple things without contradiction. Corporate America wasn't quick to forgive. Media outlets struggled to frame her with respect, even as they profited from her image. But none of that affected Billie Jean's sense of direction. She traveled the country speaking about Title X, not just as a policy, but as promise. She summoned board members, presidents, fellow athletes. She wore those rooms like she had worn center court, never demanding they listen, simply refusing to leave until they did. She advocated for HIV/AIDS awareness during a cultural moment where silence was the preferred strategy, especially from those in power. Again, no applause, no parades, just presence. In the decades to follow, others would call her pioneer, icon, hero. But those titles felt like labels, retrofitted for comfort. What she had done was simpler. She kept showing up, kept risking her name, her comfort, her income for something that was never about just her. She did not emerge unscathed. She lived with those scars quite visibly, but she also lived with remarkable peace, because in a world where erasure comes easily, Billie Jean King continuously turned the lights back on. She will be remembered for Wimbledon, for the Astrodome, for the legislation she championed, but perhaps most for the staying, for choosing again and again to remain. When retreat would have been so much easier. No headlines are written about that, but history remembers. The story did not end at the net. It rarely does. Even when she stepped back from competition, knees repaired but never the same. Travel bags retired to closets. Billie Jean King did not grow still. Retirement, for her, was not retreat. It was redirection, a new form of movement. She began building something beyond herself. The speeches continued. The interviews, the dinners in institutional ballrooms where applause rang hollow but purpose stood firm. She used every platform offered to her, not for recognition, but to amplify the unheard. Her voice didn't change, its tone measured, clear, respectfully insistent, but it now reached further. And by then, the world had learned enough to listen longer. The Women's Sports Foundation, which she had envisioned years earlier, grew in scope and influence. Its mission was practical and passionately simple: equal opportunities and support for women and girls in all sports. At every level, Billie Jean met with federal agencies, school boards, CEOs. She handed out grants, launched mentorship programs, built systems where none had existed. She wasn't nostalgic, she was strategic. As Title X grew up, she defended it like an older sibling, vigilant, unapologetic, relentless. She knew laws didn't enforce themselves, that progress didn't possess permanence, so she kept pushing. When media narratives began highlighting a new era of powerful female athletes, Billie Jean never tried to reclaim attention. Instead, she showed up for them courtside at Serena Williams matches, in the locker room with Megan Rapinoe, at press conferences where she was often the only figure from a previous generation still demanding change. She never required credit, she required continuation. The Billie Jean King National Tennis Center opened in 2006, its name etched in concrete and glass, towering near the courts of the US Open. The dedication was quiet, like her. No ego, just gratitude. Still, it mattered, not for her, but for the girls walking beneath its banner, girls who might now see how names could serve, not as markers of ego, but as invitations. A reminder that history, too, could belong to them. She spoke more candidly as the years passed, about sexuality, mental health, loneliness, about ambition, partnership, loss. She did not pose as a figurehead. She shaped herself into a companion for those navigating the same. And when she met with presidents, whether at the White House or in quiet conference room corners, she carried the same ethos as she once did with her racket. Direct, specific, unwavering. In 2009, President Obama awarded her the Presidential Medal of Freedom. She accepted it with humility, but refused to let the moment float untethered. She used the podium to mention Title X, to remind Americans that not all legacies become law, but the ones that do must be protected, because legacy is not static, it hums, and it echoes. When the LGBTQ+ community faced continued legislative attacks, Billie Jean was not a sideline supporter. She joined marches, sent open letters, called senators directly. Her advocacy was often unseen, preserved not in documentaries, but in votes swayed by a private phone call, in meetings where her presence alone shifted the temperature of the room. And with each passing year, the athletes who once called her a hero began calling her a friend. Venus and Serena Williams credited her for reimagining the template they were born into. Naomi Osaka thanked her not for inspiration, but for architecture. When Megan Rapinoe asked for her support in equal pay negotiations with US Soccer, Billie Jean didn't advise from afar. She joined the table. She helped draft the strategy, because the game remained unfinished. Her autobiography sold well, but she barely promoted it. Book tours and talk show circuits felt secondary to the work itself. She wasn't interested in becoming an icon frozen in her peak. She was interested in using her age like wisdom accumulated, mobile, radiating into ongoing struggle. Even in recent years, she traveled lightly but often to conferences, to rallies, to underserved schools with outdated gymnasiums and young girls with eyes full of maybe. She told them that power didn't require permission, that a whisper could still move crowds. She had always believed movement was sacred, and wherever it pulsed, in sport, in culture, in the quiet dignity of choice, Billie Jean King was there, not as monument, but as mirror, showing us, again and again, what it looked like to shape the world, not with volume, but with vision. The court is empty now, not abandoned, just paused, like breath between verses of a favorite lullaby. The lines are still there, meticulously drawn. The net droops slightly from the day's weight. Somewhere far off, a sprinkler ticks. A moth flutters near the lights that flicker over what once witnessed applause. But now, silence, and within it, memory. Imagine that space. The hush after effort. The stillness after 1,000 footsteps chasing bounce and spin. The trace of chalk on skin. The ache in shoulders that once bore everything from strategy to revolution. Here, beneath a dusky sky, Billie Jean King becomes something more than a name written into record books. She becomes a kind of vow, not in volume, not in troublemaking myth, but in steadiness. She is not the racket or the scorecard. She is the space left behind once history has passed, quietly through, because some people hit the ball, others change the game. And then there are those who remake the world in its image and still have enough softness left to ask you how your day went. Legacy like hers doesn't end, it just quiets, moves into gesture and repetition, into new voices retelling old stories, retwisting their meaning, finding warmth and weight in what came before, in the echo of those final games. Billie didn't ask to be remembered with fanfare. Her hopes were simpler, that the next girl would never be. Asked if she belonged, that the next athlete wouldn't lose their home for being honest, that fairness would not be argued, but assumed, and that strength could be both fierce and gentle, resilient and kind. Often, when the crowds departed and the lights dimmed, she'd remain seated, sometimes alone, sometimes with someone who understood that silence is not absence. It's reflection. You could see her then not as a champion, but as a person still examining the weight of the moment, still wondering what else could be made better, clearer, fairer. She once said she saw the court as life in miniature, as a place where responsibility meets rhythm. She wasn't wrong. Every serve comes with consequence. Every line tells you where things end on inevitably. When something new begins, Billie Jean King wasn't afraid of beginnings or endings. She simply made both beautiful by arriving prepared. These days, the game continues, name error after error. But somewhere, buried beneath the scoreboard stats and bright sponsor logos, still lives the quiet truth she carried. Everywhere that you can be excellent and true, that you can be brave without noise, that trying changes everything, especially when done with care, and that even when the crowd does not cheer, courage echoes anyway. Now the night fully settles. Moonlight gathers over the court like an old friend pulling up a chair. There is no need to replay each match in perfect sequence. Not now you know the rhythm. You've walked alongside her, felt the serve in your chest, the principle in her stride. Perhaps this restfulness you feel isn't merely sleep. Perhaps it's permission to be strong in softness, to lead without spotlight, to be full and flawed and daring. And when you wake tomorrow, the match won't be over. You'll just re-enter it, carrying her rhythm in your palms, a whisper returned into the world, a breath placed carefully between heartbeats. Good night, number 1.